The global pandemic has changed wine marketing forever, and the old ways of reaching the trade aren't as efficient or effective as they once were. If you're a producer or region looking to reach more people with less effort and have been affected by travel restrictions and uncertainty, register for one of my upcoming free wine marketing digital roundtables at interpretingwine.com/roundtable. I'm Lawrence Francis, host of the Interpreting Wine podcast, the place to learn from thought leaders in the world of wine and marketing, welcoming you to the D4 and D5 series. Across these 2 episodes, I'll be exploring the D4 and D5 diploma units in the company of Lauren Denier of the WSET. Broadly, these episodes cover exam format, past wines, examiners' comments, theory questions, and examples of methods of production, style and quality. We'll also be covering some specific questions that have been submitted to me on my Instagram page. And I'm sure that if you or anyone you know is sitting the D5 Fortified exam anytime soon, you're going to learn a hell of a lot from Lauren today. Enjoy!
Okay, so looking at D5, I'm going to go through the format of the exam, have a quick look at some of the past wines, so you can kind of be reassured that they are the kinds of wines that you would hopefully expect to get in an exam. Have a quick look at some examiners' comments and some things that I have spoken to students about, where there have been some errors made, and a very brief look at the way the questions are structured with a little focus on those command verbs, just to make sure that people understand how to answer the questions as set. Then I'm going to talk a bit about how important it is to understand the methods of production and the maturation and the timing of fortification. I can't obviously go into too much detail, and this is why you've got the online book to read all of those things. But if you understand the production methods, the way these wines are made, and that for D5 in particular, that really does correspond to the style and the quality of the wines. And although I wouldn't encourage identifying or trying too hard to identify the wine, there are some wines where actually it can only be that wine that you have in the glass. So you can do a lot of kind of detective work around what the wine definitely isn't and potentially what it is. And you can really relate these methods of production in particular at this level, this unit, to quality. And I'll talk a little bit about how to write about the quality of a wine. And actually, there's a few interesting things to consider for the aging potential for fortified wines as well. I'm going to talk about appearance at some point, because a lot of people get appearance wrong. It's only 2 marks. I'm not going to talk for ages, but just to how you approach assessing the appearance of a fortified wine. For some reason, a lot of students like to assess it in a completely different way than they've assessed the appearance of wines previously. So yeah, that's what I'll be covering for this this part.
Fantastic.
So to start off with the format, now everyone should really know the format. If you're going into these exams, there's lots of information about the format. It's in the specification, it'll be in the guidance, all which is available on the Diploma Student Resource area on the online classroom. Every WSET student has access to that. I would thoroughly recommend reading these important documents, so you know exactly what's out there. So it's an hour and a half exam, 90 minutes, and it is recommended that you spend 45 minutes on the theory part and 45 minutes on the tasting part. So it's 2 parts, but combined 1 sitting. You'll need 3 glasses for the exam because you've got your 3 wines. So the theory questions have been formulated so that 45 minutes is a sufficient amount of time, or should be a sufficient amount of time, to answer to the highest possible level. So there's no need to spend more time. and you definitely don't want to spend less time. That would result in 15 minutes per wine. Even if you're a super fast taster and you can get everything done in less than 45 minutes, it's up to you. No one's saying do the theory now, do the tasting now. You can do them in any order, but that's generally the recommendation. And I do think that 15 minutes is a good amount of time to assess a wine properly and write a good quality assessment note. And to really understand the wine and really get to grips with the flavours and aromas. And the flavours and aromas in fortified wines can really, really help with understanding the method of production as well as other things. So I'm going to have a quick look at the past wines that have come up in the exam. But just before I do, just to talk about the three wines that are chosen, they aren't necessarily linked. So don't expect that you're going to go in and they're going to say these three wines are all from the same region. That's not generally the case. Or, these three wines are all made in this method of production. That doesn't usually happen. So they can be anything. There may be a question on the back page of the of your tasting booklet where you're going to write your tasting notes. And so one thing that is really important to do, which people slipped up on a few exams ago, was not turning the page over. I would say one of the first things you need to do in the exam is look at every single piece of paper with questions on it, turn it over and check you're not missing anything. Have a little look at how much the marks are worth for the areas outside of the nose, the appearance, nose, palate, quality assessment and suitability for bottle aging. So there'll be some extra marks at the bottom of the tasting note for method of production, region, grape varieties, etc. So have a look and see how much they're worth, just so you make sure you give yourself enough time to answer everything correctly.
Just one thing I'd like to ask around, simply because it did actually come up in the last episode when you were talking about the wines for D4, was actually chilling. You mentioned that the sparkling wines are all served chilled, and I'm just curious then. Say, obviously, there's lots of wines that can come up, but say a Fino were to come up, a sherry that's traditionally served chilled, would this be served chilled in the exam?
That would be nice, wouldn't it? Because it might give you an idea that it's a Fino. But no, they're not chilled. The reason they're chilled for sparkling wine is health and safety. You shouldn't be opening bottles of unchilled sparkling wine because it's quite dangerous. So, yeah, and it's very difficult when you're doing these exams on these large scales, which we do at WSET school, to chill the wines because of the facilities. You need like a lot of fridges. So we do it for D4 because it's a necessity, but actually it's not a necessity for D5 or D3. So they will not be chilled.
Okay, so no extra clues from the...
no extra clues from the vintage port is at room temperature, but the Fino is chilled. No, none of that, unfortunately. Actually, coming back to the tasting note, on the previous session, I did specify the amount of marks you get in each part. It should be common knowledge, really, for anyone preparing for these exams, but just to reiterate that. So it's 2 marks on appearance, and as I said, I'll talk about that in a bit. Then you've got 6 marks for the nose. So 5 of those are for aromas. That doesn't mean write just 5 aromas. That means write at least 5 relevant aromas and more where possible, to maximise your chances of picking up the same aromas as the examiner. And then you've got on the palate 10 to 12 marks. So whether there are tannins involved or not. Red, white and white wines aren't so easy to distinguish with fortified wine, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But if it's a red wine, then you do have to discuss tannins, even if there's hardly any, and the nature of them. And then you've got 6 marks for your quality assessment and 3 marks for suitability for bottle aging. So previous wines, we have had a Manzanilla in the previous exam. So I'd like to think that if you had a wine like that, you would be in your head thinking Fino, or Manzanilla. There's really nothing else it could be. So therefore, your quality assessment is going to be where the examiner is going to see your understanding, your further understanding of a wine like that. There was an Amontillado as well. And again, I can talk a little bit about why an Amontillado is an Amontillado. And then we've had quite a few Madeiras. So there was a 15-year-old, and I'm not sure what it was. I think it was like a Cercial or Rodello. I'm not sure. That came up. And then in the exam before that, there was another 15-year-old Madeira. There was a Mori, a vintage Mori, a dry Oloroso. Oloroso should be dry. If it isn't, then it shouldn't be called Oloroso. And an Amontillado, a Fino, a Muscat de Beaume de Venise, a Rutherglen Muscat. There's been a Ruby Port and a Vintage Port. So, occasionally you'll see that you've got like a Ruby Port and a Vintage Port. And I think probably examiners are looking there to see how you can distinguish between the two. And so there may be a little bit of a test within the three. And then there's been a 10-year-old Tawny Port, a 15-year-old Boal, and Pedro Jimenez. So, yeah, quite a few Madeira, only 15-year-olds, interestingly, but you never know what might come up. That's not me saying there's going to be another 15-year-old Madeira in the next exam. I have no idea. I don't work for awards. All I'd like to see is that wines have come up that can be identified, or at least the methods of production can be identified. So, they're clear examples of what they should be. Because I think for fortified wine, it is very much focused on production methods. It is a great unit for being able to deduce things. Like, I really feel like you can be a proper detective in these exams, because if we think about the methods of production and the maturation processes, it will inevitably lead to certain styles of wines. So, the very basic point, you've got whether a wine is sweet or not. And if it's sweet, then it's because it was fortified during the fermentation. So that's one key thing. And this all links to the theory. So if you can understand, if you know the theory behind the wine and you link that to why they do it, then that's probably the core. And then definitely for tasting, but also very helpful for theory questions. They've had questions before where they've said, like, from this point to this point, what's the method of production? So, right, chronologically, but it won't necessarily say describe the method of production. It'll say describe and explain. So, okay, well, they fortify then because you get a sweet style of wine, and you would probably want to explain how sweet. So how that would translate if you were to describe that wine to someone. So if we were talking about, let's say, a Malmsey or Malvasir Madeira, say, well, they fortify early on because you want a residual sugar level of, usually just over 100 grams a litre of sugar, which results in a sweet wine. It's that kind of detail that you'll need in the theory. But in the tasting, you just need to go, okay, I'm recognising this has been aged purely oxidatively, the acidity is high, and it's got quite a lot of sugar. So and the quality is high. So my options are, well, I can rule out sherry because of the acidity. And I can rule out blended sherry again. I'm thinking maybe that it is a Madeira, and it's a high quality Madeira because of all the well-defined oxidative characteristics, because of the balance. And then I'm getting quite a lot of sweetness. So therefore I'm thinking it's one of those noble grape varieties because of the quality. So I'm going towards Boal or Malvasir. And then you use those reasonings in your, when they ask you why. So you can rule out things, and then there can only be certain things as well. I think that's the beauty of fortified wine, is there are some wines they cannot actually be anything else. So it's slightly unforgivable if you describe a Muscat de Beaume de Venise as a pale cream sherry, just because they might look the same. So it's understanding the methods of production is key. And I think if you can do that it's all for the taking. I remember doing a mock for fortified when I was doing my diploma, and I got something incredibly embarrassing, like 37%. And I remember that because you don't forget moments like that when you feel so deflated. And it was purely because I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I just thought, that looks a bit brown and a bit sweet. It's probably this. I hadn't calibrated acidity. I hadn't worked out the methods of production. So when I think back to that paper, I was just, I was like treading water, not really sure what I was doing. And then I went and did some tasting with someone, and we really thought about it when we were tasting each individual wine. And practice and an understanding, really.
I think it's a really interesting point, actually, because I've been in those situations before in exams and kind of in life as well, where you essentially take one piece of information and you generalize it, and the kind of the fact of the matter is, if under stressed conditions, it's kind of when tunnel vision can come up, and it's possible that can happen, that the tunnel vision in this setting means that the appearance, as you say, how it looks, and maybe just that first sniff, it then kind of colors and clouds and influences everything above that. And I'm sure that the tips that you shared there, just around, I think, getting perspective, taking a step back, and maybe looking for where different clues kind of intercept, not just looking at the color, using the acidity, using the aromas, and just drawing back and maybe just giving yourself that additional, it might only be 30 seconds, but 30 seconds is, I think, better than 3 seconds in an exam where you may be kind of pushing yourself to get to an answer as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think that now, when I was sitting the stage 2 exams recently, we had some fortified wines, and they're where I feel most comfortable now, out of all the wines I'll get in an exam, because I just know that I can taste them, assess them, and therefore I can work out what they're likely to be. Don't always get it right. I did get rather Glen Muscat confused with the Pedro Jimenez in the recent exams, but at the end of the day, they're made in very similar ways. And, on the palate, structurally, they're pretty similar, the levels of residual sugar. So I'm not going to beat myself up about it, but I hope to think that my answers that I wrote will have included some things that are relevant for the actual wine that it was. But, in what they say in the examiner's report is that, when they do put in 2 wines that from the same region, for example, 2 sherries, they're not there to trick the candidates. They are there to test their ability to detect the difference in production that lead to contrasting styles of wines, but made from the same grape variety. So it is that understanding of the production method and how it does lead to different styles. We know with sherry, the main grape variety is Palomino, but we have all these different styles because they are made so differently. One of the things as well that the downfalls, so having a look at sort of examiners' comments from previous years and things that I've come across is that, just not reading the paper correctly is one thing. I discussed in the last podcast that it's that time management is incredibly important. So, it's not just understanding the content of the book, but it's also knowing how to manage your time, looking at the weighting of the questions. We discussed that in more detail, didn't we? That, every theory question there's 100 marks there for the whole theory paper. Each question will have a certain amount of marks allocated to it. The more the marks are, obviously the more time and potentially the more detail you have to give. And you do see quite a few questions where, as I said before, the method of production is important, because they might ask you about the style of the wine, how that might link to the method of production, or vice versa. So I'm just going to talk about the appearance of the wines, because I think this is something that scares people with fortified wines. It certainly can be intimidating, but it can also be very helpful. So kind of look at the appearance as being a helpful thing rather than a scary thing. I know that, again, when going back to this exam, these exams haunt you, that I had, I think it was five brown wines in front of me, quite deep brown, most of them. I was just like, they can't all be Pedro Jimenez. And so you kind of look at it and go, oh dear. But then you go, actually, do you know what? There's a lot of things that these wines absolutely cannot be, and some things that they're going to have to be. So instead of looking at them all and going, oh my goodness, are they white wines? Are they red wines? Just kind of think, okay, right, what are they definitely not? And appearance is only 2 marks. So it is quite important to work out whether the wine is a white wine or a red wine. And that is quite difficult sometimes, particularly when you've got very oxidized wines of either white or red. So if we think about, and particularly something like Madeira, where Madeira is made with white grapes and also made with Tinta Negra, which is sometimes trying to disguise it and make it look like it's a white grape variety. So that's not your friend, really, when that happens. But if you are in a situation where you've got that, you should see a slight reddish, almost more orange rather than, say, green hue to the wine. What people lose marks is assessing a wine from the intensity wrong. They have a white wine in front of them and it is amber or brown in colour. And if you've got an amber or brown wine in front of you, the chances are it is not pale. Okay, so if you think about a pale wine, and we're comparing the appearance of fortified wines to all wines. So if you benchmark in your head what a pale wine looks like, and I would say Pinot Grigio, okay? Pinot Grigio, white Pinot Grigio, because I know there's a few rosés out there, white Pinot Grigio. And then you think, okay, does this wine look anything like, in terms of intensity, like a Pinot Grigio? No. So it's deep. So you get a lot these oxidized wines, so your Amontillados, your Olorosos, your Madeiras, your white Madeiras, your your various others. They are going to be deep amber or brown, potentially medium, but highly unlikely. So remember that they're not pale just because. I don't know why. You've just got to compare them to all other wines out there.
Yeah. But, and again, this may or may not ring true to anybody listening, but it sounds as though maybe what's happening in some of those situations is that people are calibrating the color against other fortified wines and looking specifically there rather than, as you say, taking a step back. The Pinot Grigio test, kind of trying to calibrate this against the kind of the world of wines and all the wines that are out there, because you have got a standardized approach to tasting, haven't you? A standardized approach.
You know, and at the other end of the spectrum, you do have your pale lemon wines as well. So you've got your Finos, your Manzanillas, although they can vary, but you know, your Tio Pepe, for example, is pale lemon, and then your Muscat de Beaume de Venise, usually pale lemon, white ports, the not oxidized white ports, those are pale lemon, and your pale cream, of course, is pale lemon. So, but they are the only pale lemon wines. So again, that's quite nice, because I remember when I did my exam, I had 3 pale lemon wines in front of me. And I was like, I wasn't expecting that. But actually it's a gift, because you smelt one. I was like, okay, biologically aging, 100% biologically aging. However, on the palate, let's see whether it's a blended sherry or not. So one happened to be a Manzanilla, one happened to be Croft Original, so your blended pale cream, and then the other one was a Muscat de Beaume de Venise. So nice, distinctive wines, actually. But if you got one that you weren't sure what it was, but it wasn't biologically aged and it wasn't aromatic, like Muscat de Venise, then it's, a white port. So, don't forget about that. And talking of port, method of production there, you've got your different styles, but the alcohol is such a key thing in port, with that 20, sort of around 20%. So it's important to know the specific differences that you're going to get. And we talk about this in class. So, the timing of fortification, one thing. So is it dry? So if it's dry, it's sherry. End of. Every other fortified wine has got some sweetness. So, well, within the specification. So, your Cercial Madeira is not dry. It has got residual sugar. So, and if you can taste that, then that's great. So there's that timing of fortification. There's the maturation. So there are wines that are young and fresh and youthful and haven't really matured, like some of your Vin Doux Naturel, like your Muscat de Venise, your young ruby ports, for example. And then you've got biologically aged wines. So that's your Fino, your Manzanillo, your Amontillado, Palo Cortado to an extent, but very difficult to find that, I would say. Don't beat yourself up over if you don't get a Palo Cortado in an exam. And then you've got, 100% oxidatively aged wines like your Tawny Ports, your Olorosos, Pedro Jimenez, for example, as well. And then bottle aging, which is more sort of for your vintage port, but can be for some Vin Doux Naturel as well. So that's pretty much it. That's if you understand the maturation methods and the timing of fortification, you have the resulting styles, and then those resulting styles can lead you to a good idea of what the wine might be. And that's the key to the tasting, really, as long as you're tasting correctly. So you need to be able to recognize certain things. And then grape varieties can be helpful. So in Madeira, you would expect high levels of acidity. You get lower levels of acidity for Palomino. So that's one way, if you're not sure, to kind of distinguish between the two. If you can, I think there are some things that we refer to for the Master of Wine as laterals. Maybe they're referred to that as well with the diploma, where you get things confused with other things. I don't think it's so important here, because if you get something confused with something else, it's probably a very valid reason. And actually your tasting note is going to be virtually there anyway. But, if you think you might be confused, it might be worth tasting a ruby port next to a Mori, to look at the different levels of alcohol and to look at the different flavour and aroma profiles. So, it's not a long list, the wines for fortified at D4. And so I do think it is quite nice to be able to kind of work out the things that are individual for each wine. So because of that, I would do, in terms of revision, I think quality assessment is very important, because you can get, like they have had in past exams, they've had a vintage port next to a fine ruby port. So when they say fine, it's just a word. It doesn't really mean anything. So you'd be expecting to put something like acceptable, potentially, acceptable or good for your fine ruby port, and then the vintage port should always be outstanding. And if it's a young vintage port, that's always a bit tricky, and people do underestimate those. But what you're looking for is something that's got real aging potential and has got an amazing structure and really concentrated. And that's where you'll see you've got a vintage port rather than just a young port. And it might be that you get an older vintage port in an exam as well. And if you do, then it should already have some tertiary characteristics. And if you're really lucky, you might notice some sediment in your glass. They're usually quite opaque. You can't see much. So, so those are some like little little tips and things to think about in the exam. But I don't think I can't really emphasize enough how important the method of production is. So talking about the quality assessment, you will need to refer to the method of production in your quality assessment to show your understanding of the wine. So the same things, Blick always applies. So balance, and here you can talk about the balance of sugar often, because you get a lot of sweet wines for fortified wines. But I would say what's very important is the integration of alcohol, because if you've got very well integrated alcohol, it's usually a sign that the wine is a bit older because it's had that chance to integrate well. So that's one possibility. It doesn't need to have been, if it's a young Muscat de Beaune de Venise, I wouldn't say that the alcohol is not integrated, but it can be maybe a sign for when you're looking at wines that have undergone some maturation. So that's really important. You can talk about tannins and for your ports, and if you do get the Tinta Negra for Madeira, for example, and for Grenache-based VDNs, then I'll talk sweetness and acidity are good. Sweetness and concentration are good. So in balance, one of the things they say in the examiner's reports is not to just talk about, it's balanced, because when I think about balance, it's about something not stick. We want wines where we don't have unpleasant things sticking out. So what is stopping that, or what is creating harmony? So, sugar is creating harmony with the acidity in the wine, for example. So sugar and acidity balance, that's one of the things that is easy to talk about, particularly with D4 as well. And then the fact that the alcohol is well integrated, that can be a separate piece of information. So balance is very important. We know that the length or the finish of the wine, and it's not enough to talk about the actual length. You need to talk about the nature of the finish. That applies across the board for diploma now. And for something like fortified wines, sometimes you can get an alcohol dominated finish, or you can get a sugar dominated finish. So it's you can mention that if that's the case, or if it's very fruity or savory or complex, that's something else you can discuss. Intensity, identifiable characteristics. Now here I think the examiners are looking for you to talk about the characteristics that you're getting and linking them to a method of production. So if you're saying get really well defined characteristics of olive, bruised apple, then you say, because this wine has been aged biologically. That's a key thing. You're saying what has given this wine these characteristics. If you're picking up lots of intense nutty caramel, dried fruit aromas because it's been oxidatively aging, maybe it's an Amontillado, so you've got a bit of both. But the thing is, if you're writing all of this and you're writing in your quality assessment what the aromas are and how it's linked to the method of production, if the next part of your question is what's the method of production, well, you kind of work that out. And if they're saying what's the region of this wine, and you're writing all of these things, and you look back at the palate and you've got low acidity and you've got dryness, it's like, well, this is therefore an Oloroso or an Amontillado, So it's not about guessing; it's about making deductions. Because I can't emphasize enough how not to guess what the wine is. That's where you get yourself into trouble. So continuing with the quality assessment, so you've got the intensity and identifiable characteristics there. Complexity, again, where's the complexity coming from? So is that complexity from extended aging? So how old is this wine? Is this been matured for a short period of time, or not at all, for a medium length period of time, for a long period of time? I would say when you're kind of getting to around 10 years, we're talking quite a long-term aging there. And then other things to think about are, again, potentially the texture of the wine, anything else that's going to validate your reason for it being acceptable, good, very good, or outstanding. But I would say definitely integration of alcohol, the maturation length, and the maturation method are things that you can be referencing and probably should be referencing if relevant in your quality assessment. And then they can also be used, again, if you need to justify the reason for a method of production. For suitability for bottle aging, it's quite an interesting one because actually most fortified wines aren't meant to age any further. They're either fully developed or they're meant to be drunk in their youth, or for things like Manzanilla and Fino, and particularly on Rama, they need to be drunk like straight away. They are very, very, very fresh wines. So, they will deteriorate. So it's not that they will hold, whereas a lot will hold, they will actually deteriorate. So that's important. If you get a Manzanilla or a Fino, then you'd say, no, this is a fresh wine. It's tangy. You need to drink it now, because if you don't, it will deteriorate over time. Whereas most of them, particularly any wine that's had any oxidative aging, like any oxidative aging, is fully developed, because the producer could have aged it for far longer if they wanted to. They've chosen when to release it because that's the optimum time for them to release it, which is drinking now. So you don't need, it's not going to get any better. So yes, so for most oxidized wines, let's think Tawny Port, your Amontillado, Oloroso, etc., Pedro Jimenez even, those are wines that, rather Glen Muscat, I haven't talked much about that. I think it's because I'm still suffering from PTSD with the exams. So they are wines that they are ready to drink. They won't improve. They're fully developed. They're not. Nothing's going to happen to them. Basically, really, when they're talking about suitability for aging, they're not asking you how long can you keep the wine for. They're saying, is it going to improve over time? Is it going to evolve over time? Well, no, those wines aren't. Nothing's going to happen. When you talk about Madeira, it's fine to say this is a wine that will hold for a long time, because that's what we know Madeira for, that high acidity, the fact they've always got sugar, particularly the higher quality wines, not so much your Tinta Negra kind of estufagem methods. Then they're not very important to know the different methods of production within Madeira when you are referencing quality. Okay, so just to be clear, you've got the Cantero, which makes more complex wines, oxidatively aged, slower, and then you've got the estufagem, which is like a speeded up process using stainless steel, and then later aged. And you can get a blend of the two, but that's not really that important. So just as an aside there. So Madeira you can talk about is holding potential, but you never ever need to put a time frame ever for any of the units. So D4, D5, D3, don't ever say, oh, this wine, it's drinking really nicely now. It'll probably last another 3 years, and you don't need to do anything like that. Either it is suitable for aging or it isn't, and then the reason why or why not, and what's going to happen. Okay. So it's 3 marks, straightforward.
And so something that comes to mind, and this may or may not be particularly relevant for the listener, but just when it comes to vintage port, because I'm aware that out there in the marketplace, there's, I believe, quite a significant section of people who actually consume those very young, enjoy them very young. So I'm guessing technically, were a fairly young vintage port to be served. I mean, you've already spoken about the aging potential and quality considerations, but I guess there are, as I understand it, there are the kind of 2 windows in which people really like to drink those. It's like fairly young or put them down to age and have them in the future.
I think that's a very good point. I think the thing about vintage port is it does have that huge potential for aging. Like, they come across very youthful after even 20 years. And with improved let's say techniques or more modern equipment in the wineries now, these wines are sort of cleaner, more approachable in their youth, more tannin management and stuff. So you can enjoy vintage ports at a younger age than you might think to. I mean, when I was in the Douro early last year, they said we would expect a vintage port to be sort of drunk, around the kind of from 30 years onwards, sort of 50 years. And that's your classic vintage port, single kinter, slightly different, usually younger. But yeah, in an exam now you have only two ways to describe the suitability for bottle aging, and that is it is or it isn't. Now, in level 3, they have a too young option. So we don't have a too young option. So you would never say it's not suitable for bottle aging, because of course it will be, unless it's fully developed. And I just can't imagine that awards are going to be coming out with the 50-year-old vintage ports. Never say never, but and even then they probably still have potential for aging. So yeah, with a young vintage port, it's always going to have potential for aging. There's no need to describe it as being too young. In fact, I would hesitate to do anything like that, because actually I think that ends up in the kind of personal preference bracket. So like you say, some people like to drink them younger and some people like to drink them when they're older.
Yeah, again, thank you so much. I really feel as though you've gone into the depth of the D5 there in a very different way than I've ever covered on the podcast. So thank you again so much. What I would just like to do in closing is just to mention a question that I had from Instagram, which is really, I think, really related to that whole idea of self-study, which I think actually probably a lot of listeners can relate to, given the pandemic and maybe some of the difficulties with people being able to meet up with one another. It's maybe been more difficult than previously to get together and do those practice tastings. And I wonder if potentially, just even from your own experience, that there was anything that you adapted when you were obviously preparing for your Master of Wine exams that maybe you had to do on this occasion that maybe in the past you may have done kind of in a group and you've been sort of forced to change your approach?
That is a good question. And I will say one thing around tasting is that it was much more difficult to taste in the same way, not being able to meet up with people and share bottles, not being able to go to trade tastings. So the exposure to these wines was more tricky. In that sense, though, for D4 and D5, you don't need to taste everything. You need to be aware of the wines. You need to know how they ought to taste. And, when I was doing my D3, I felt very underprepared, even though I didn't have these issues that we have now. And I just thought, as long as you can recognise things like high acidity, full body, etc., alcohol to a point. Also, just on that point, with fortified wine, the alcohol scale is different. I'm sure they're aware of that, the students. But as long as you feel confident that you can you've calibrated, then don't feel that enormous pressure to taste absolutely everything before the exam, because you can work it out. And it's not about guessing the wine either. One of the things about fortified wine is that you can buy a lot in miniatures. So, there are websites where you can buy small bottles. So that can be quite helpful. They are generally less expensive than most other wines, particularly if you're in the UK, which we're a bit obsessed with these inexpensive fortified wines. So there tends to be plenty in the supermarkets. And that, just don't worry too much, as long as you have an idea of what the wines, the production methods, how that links to how they're going to be on the palate, and the quality levels. As it's probably dry notes is quite a good thing to write. So if you take a piece of paper, write the SAT areas on there, and think, okay, what would your typical 10-year-old tawny port taste like? And maybe write a dry note around that, and think about how that might differ from a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old, or just your kind of reserve or basic tawny, for example. Then in terms of theory knowledge, well, each to their own. One person will retain information in one way, whereas for others it can be a bit more difficult. I certainly like to supplement the information that I read with things like podcasts and with webinars. And the school has done a lot of webinars over lockdown. We really got into that, and I've done one on sherry as well. So, which goes into even more detail. That's on YouTube. You can just put WSET Heref, and that will come up. It's on the website as well. So I think those are really helpful. There's lots of books out there as well as the materials. So remember, you don't need to know anything above and beyond what's in the online materials. But personally, I think it's nice to read different ways. Other people's writing, because it's a different style. I know people use flashcards. There are apps as well, like Cram and Quizlet. So it might be that some other wonderful diploma student has created their own, which you can look at. But then, of course, who knows how accurate they are? Just a little disclaimer. And it really depends on the individual. But we supply, for our students, we supply questions, practice questions. So if you have access to those, then hopefully you did them, because I think it's a bit late now.
Yet another huge thank you to Lauren. It was an absolute pleasure to have you back on the podcast again. Do see below for Lauren's Instagram handle. And if you're eager for more Fortified resources, I've also included a link to the webinar that Lauren mentioned, the Journey to Jerez. And I've also included a link to the Interpreting Wine Port series that covers an introduction to the style, a tasting and comparison, and an interview with a notable port producer. That brings the D4 and D5 series to a close for now, so do make sure that you're subscribed to Interpreting Wine Podcast to be alerted when the next series goes live. If you know someone who would find this episode useful, do please share the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/449. And if you found it really useful, I would love to hear your feedback, preferably via an iTunes review using the same link. And of course, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, or email hello@interpretingwine.com. Good luck with the exams, and see you next time.